Okay, well, welcome. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. And I also want to thank the organizers of Disability and Work in Canada, because being able to pull this session together and the whole conference is very exciting. And just a special thanks to the four partners that are part of that Disability and Work in Canada. It's the Centre for Research on Work Disability Policy, the Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work, Inclusion NL, and the Ontario Network of Injured Workers Groups. So congratulations to you all for being able to keep this work going during this time where we meet through Zoom boxes and phone calls and emails and other ways without being in the same room. This session today is an exciting one, and we're going to have a brief overview from the policy session, the policy roundtable that was held in June in 2020, and some folks listening in today and participating today would have attended those roundtables in past years. So we'll hear about what the highlights were from this year's roundtable, and then we'll move into a discussion with guests from 3 different provinces about initiatives in their areas and what they're working on and learning, and sharing that information with everybody as it relates back to the strategy on disability and work in Canada. So I'm going to start by introducing Ron Saunders, and Ron is the adjunct scientist with the Institute for Work and Health, and that, I believe, is headquartered in Toronto, Ontario. And Ron is also one of the members on the steering committee for Disability and Work in Canada, so one of the folks that has been working behind the scenes to get this conference on the go. So Ron, if you'd start maybe by giving the overview, and then I'll introduce the next 3 guests after that.
So thank you again, and I'm this session of major initiatives from selected provinces. Most of that is going to be a discussion that Mary's going to be moderating with the panelists. But to kick it off, I'm just going to talk a little bit about key points that were made at a policy roundtable we held last June with senior government officials from across the country. The Disability and Work in Canada initiative has been hosting these roundtables for the past several years, and we held a virtual roundtable in June to discuss 3 things. And so one of them was to exchange ideas for implementation of the Pan-Canadian Strategy for Disability and Work that was shared at the conference in November of last year. And that, of course, is a focus for the conference this year. We also talked about COVID, of course. We talked about how governments are addressing the implications of COVID-19 for persons with disabilities. And some members of the steering committee shared information they had about important work underway relevant to the strategy. So those are the things that we talked about. There were a lot of ideas and issues that were put forward. I'm only going to touch on some that came up repeatedly. So there were a half dozen things that came up more than once over the course of the day. One of them was the importance of ongoing forums for consultation with persons with disabilities and community organizations serving them. And really, that's part of the larger principle that we've tried to use to guide this work, this initiative, which is the importance of engaging people with disabilities in all stages of the work, in the development of the strategy and the implementation of the strategy. A second point that came up was COVID. That pretty much every jurisdiction that was represented talked about the attention that they're paying to COVID and the impacts of COVID-19 on persons with disabilities. A third point that came up a couple of times, but it was an interesting idea, so we thought we would share it today, is the use of a centralized fund on behalf of some governments as employers, a centralized fund that is to support accommodation, to support the cost of providing accommodation to public sector employees with disabilities. This idea that a central fund that any particular supervisor or manager might be able to draw on as necessary. So that is being either used or explored in a couple of jurisdictions. Another idea or issue that came up was the one of coordinating programs or services across departments. I think, as most people know who've been looking at issues related to people with disabilities and employment, that there are typically many different programs that provide different forms of support. Sometimes they're provided by different levels of government, and sometimes they're provided by different departments within the same jurisdiction, within the province. And so one thing that some people talked about was that it may be possible, desirable, to do a better job of coordinating programs across departments within a jurisdiction, as well as across jurisdictions where possible. And related to that was the idea of a one-stop shop or no wrong door. The idea that if someone accesses government support at a particular place, then if that's not the right place for them, or not the only right place for them, then the place they go to first should take responsibility for guiding them to the right place, or providing a navigator that can help them find the right place. So that idea came up at the roundtable as well. And the last of these that I'm going to highlight is that more than one person talked about the growth in remote work, right? People working from home as a result of COVID, what that means for people with disabilities. And I actually have just one more slide, but that slide is just to elaborate a little bit on that point, because there was a fair bit of discussion of that. And it was noted that for some people with disabilities, accommodation of their needs may be easier with remote work. For example, for some people, getting to work can be very challenging, right? Just physically getting to work can be very challenging. And so if you're able to work from home, it avoids that barrier, and that can be a positive thing. But it was also noted that some people, including people with cognitive, behavioral, or emotional disabilities, may experience negative impacts from working at home, negative impacts from isolation in particular. And also that not everybody has access to high-speed internet. And so we have to recognize that that can be a barrier, including a barrier for people with disabilities. So overall, people looked at this issue as an example of one where it's important not to treat persons with disabilities as a homogeneous group. That we have to recognize that different people have different needs, and we need to be able to address those different needs on an individualized basis. So those were the key things that came up, and I'm going to turn it back then to Mary to introduce the panel discussion that we're going to do.
Thank you, Ron. So now we're going to have a discussion amongst guests from 3 different provinces. And with us today is Yutta Fricke, and Yutta is the, just wave there, Yutta, we know who you are. Yutta is the Executive Director with the Disability Issues Office, the Government of Manitoba. And we also have Catherine Shortall, and Catherine is the Director of Disability Policy Office with the Government of Newfoundland and Labrador. And we also have Joseph Giulione, and Joseph, there he is the director of La Mirage, and that's an agency that provides supported employment in the province of Quebec. And Joseph is also the president of the board of the directors for ROCEF, and that's le Regroupment des Organismes Spécialiséés pour l'emploi des personnes handicapées, and that's representing 24 different organizations providing supported employment. So thank you for joining us, and thanks for sharing your insights and your information and your ideas. And Yutta, let's start with you. You know, the province of Manitoba's had accessibility legislation now since 2013, thereabouts, and regulations in a couple of areas, 3 areas, but one includes employment. So I wonder if you'd talk a bit about, you know, what that meant during the past few months. Was there areas in there that were helpful, guidance, and how you dealt with that there?
Thanks, Mary, and thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit about what's happening in Manitoba. And yes, you're right. COVID-19 has really changed how all of us are working and has put a new lens on the importance of our accessibility legislation. So like the Accessible Canada Act, we have standards under the legislation. The first one in customer service has already been in place since 2015. But more recently, in 2019, we enacted an employment standard. And that standard had only 2 requirements that came into effect 1 year later. And those had to do with the safety of employees, because the government felt that safety comes first. And so all employers in Manitoba already within that first year had to comply with those standards and or those requirements under the standard. So the first area, the requirement was that employers must create workplace emergency response information for employees. And the second was that if an employee required assistance, that they be a part of the conversation to identify someone they trust to assist them. So when we were rolling this out and thinking about the May 1 deadline to comply, of course, we were thinking about evacuation. We were thinking about an explosion, about fire, about safety in place, but we weren't thinking about a pandemic. So we thought that it would be important that employers message all employees, because there are so many invisible disabilities that you wouldn't know also have an impact when you're exiting a building. The person who has a heart condition and can't run down 10 sets of stairs, but there is no visible sign that the person has a disability. So we were already thinking about stuff like that. But now come COVID, of course, we're thinking about underlying conditions, about compromised immune systems. And do employers actually know, because you can't tell from seeing a person who is affected. So really our messaging has been, know all your employees, get the message out there, find out this for the safety of the whole gang, who requires an accommodation during this pandemic. And if a person requires individualized support, perhaps that means bringing files home or something like that. Make sure that that individual is a part of the conversation and helps identify who is there to support them. So that for sure has been a big difference with COVID-19, that we're thinking about the employment standard that way, but we're also thinking about customer service and the requirements there that also affect the employment workplace. So that has to do more with how you communicate with people, and is everyone part of the conversation? And Ron already mentioned that about, we're all on Zoom and having meetings together. Can everyone participate equally? Is there an option to phone in? Is there captioning, etc.? So we're looking at all of these things from the perspective of employees, as well as more broadly, access to services and access to goods for everybody, employed or not employed.
Mm-hmm. I guess you mean too, you're talking about all employers, not just the government of Manitoba, right?
Well, see, that's the thing that typically, probably like the government of Canada, I know the Ontario government did the same, that we roll out standards so that the government acts first, like with a year in advance, and models. Then the public sector, which are colleges, healthcare, crown corporations, that those with an attachment to the government, in 2 years' time, they roll out the standard. And then finally, the not-for-profit and business sector, 3 years later, comply with the different requirements of the standard. But there is this exception in employment that why wait 3 years to keep employees safe during an emergency? So all employers were given 1 year to start the discussions and having plans internally about how to keep employees safe during an emergency. Then Manitoba declared the province in a state of emergency, and we had to relook at that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you mentioned communication. I know that, Catherine, if you want to jump in terms of Newfoundland and Labrador, you've been looking at communication for a bit in terms of accessible communication.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you all. And Yutta, yes, to pick up on your initiative, really, it's interesting. And Ron, when you talked about the things coming out of the roundtable, regardless of what we're talking about in terms of focus, if it's customer service or if it's employment, we are actually talking about communication and information. And the initiative that I wanted us to focus on from a Newfoundland and Labrador perspective today was a policy document that was developed here around accessible communication. I'd like to talk a little bit about how we did it, but I really would like some time to talk about the learnings from it, because I think the two things that really have struck me so far listening to you speak is around the ongoing forums with people with disabilities and that lived experience, and how that has to be incorporated in all that we do regularly. And I'll shine a light on that when we look at some of our learnings, but also attitudinal issues that might still arise regardless of your initiatives, because my learnings will also sort of focus in on that. So the communication guide itself, really we started that several years ago, and it started with engagement with people with disabilities, community organizations of and for, to help us sort of look at and focus how to draft such a communication guide. And really, it also meant that same sort of consultation and engagement across governments. And I think that that's a really important aspect of what we do. And we saw that, Ron, in your slides as well, is that oftentimes services go across government departments, but sometimes it's not my shop, it's somebody else's. So if we're talking about accessible communication, it has to be done sort of holistically. So engagement with the experts in terms of lived experience, it was equally important to engage across departments and to have people understand what accessible communication is and why it's an essential basic right. And it does tie in directly with employment, but in everything that we do, whatever it is, how we know it's available and how we communicate that to our end users is critical in terms of being accessible. So once we did draft the communication guide, that in turn was a policy at the end, really it was important to look at implementation of that. And again, we engaged at that level with the community of and for persons with disabilities to work with us to develop actual training modules that had community input, had lived experience input. Then came inside government and the experts in terms of communications and our Centre for Learning and Development engaged in that activity and promoted the communication guidelines and the policy in practical ways, in using examples of how you might interface in a way with a service that should look differently and what that means to you. We were really, during that training and promotional piece, trying to tap into some unconscious biases and making it okay for people to be uncomfortable in order to learn. And so having that intention in our work was very purposeful and meaningful in terms of getting at what often is an attitudinal barrier, regardless of what your initiative is. And so that was during the development and the implementation stage of it, but it has an impact province-wide in terms of employment. The systems in which people can access applications for services, for employment opportunities, information around subsidy programs, accommodation supports, all of that information has to be accessible if we're going to reach the end user, which really is beneficial for all. You don't necessarily have to identify with a disability to be able to engage with a website that's very intuitive. It breaks down barriers for all people, and we certainly saw that in our communication policy. But I think what we saw during some of our learnings more recently was what happens when your expectation of your environment gets disrupted. And Newfoundland and Labrador had the privilege of experiencing a disruption provincially prior to the pandemic, when we had a very extreme snow conditions during January of this year, where services were disrupted for the first time due to weather for a prolonged time. And there was an interruption and a state of emergency called by the province. And it became really quick widely noticed by the community that our information around the state of emergency was not accessible. And I would credit the relationship that we have with the community of persons with disabilities for their trust in being able to reach out to say, this is not working for us, and for government to have misstepped but had the opportunity to self-correct. And we saw a lot of the gaps that were in our policy at that time that we were able to really swiftly respond to and address. And then when COVID-19 hit and the pandemic, and certainly put us in that global experience, we again had that disruption. We had some lessons learned from our run-in during what we have coined Snowmageddon. That helped us prepare for the pandemic, but there were still things that we had not seen in terms of imagination around disruption. And again, it was with that community support and trust that was reciprocal to be able to know that we had to lean into experts to address the issues that were being seen in terms of a quick example of it is how quickly the public health was able to acknowledge that our screening criteria to address whether or not you were experiencing the COVID virus was not really consumable through American Sign Language or the community of the deaf whose primary language is American Sign Language, and worked really quickly and succinctly with the deaf community to talk about a pathway to that criteria through ASL. And so a policy which we would have enacted and thought we were following quite cleverly up until 2020, we were able to see some holes in that, and we were able to address it. Since the emergency of COVID-19 has sort of changed for our landscape, thankfully here in Newfoundland and Labrador, what we are now seeing is some questions around, do we still need to do some of those things that we did to provide clear and plain accessible communications and information? And that's where, if time permits, I'd like to talk about sort of attitudinal barriers that still exist in terms of this idea of we just need to do one-offs during certain experiences, and we don't really understand the global impact of accessible communication and how that really trickles down to daily experiences for people all across this province. And so we can put initiatives together that address a certain focus, but at the same time, we have to be putting resources and time in addressing attitudinal barriers at the same time. I think I'll leave it there.
Because you're saying too, to make it routine, how do we stop it from being, oh, I did that and then move on, forget all about it, eh? So we'll come back to that for sure. And but I want to bring Joseph in right now, and Joseph, you both Yutta and Catherine and Ron too talked about partnerships and the importance of working with community and other persons, and I think you were doing some work in Quebec that relies heavily on the idea of partnerships and wouldn't work without it in terms of some training programs. I wonder if you can talk to us a bit about that.
Yeah, well, everything stems, for us anyway, everything stems from the government policies around the manpower shortage. I mean, we're like elsewhere in Canada, the forecast is the forecast on the negative impact of on economic growth that we need, the lack of manpower available is scary. So what's going on is the government has been trying to put policies together to sort of play that down and get more people back into the workforce. So what we've done usually in the background, look, we've been doing this a long time. We always deal more or less with the same type of partners. And these are people that are who have bought into the idea of getting people with disabilities back into the workforce, employers that will hire them and whatnot. And this time around, there was a study done here by this council. I'm going to say the French name because they don't have an English translation. Le Conseil du Patronat du Québec. Basically, they represent over 70,000 employers here in Quebec. And they did a study. And in their study, what they saw was 10% of their members actually have employees who have disabilities, and 90% of them do not have a diversity plan. So basically, we decided that maybe we should approach them with a partnership because let's face it, they are the biggest employee representatives in Quebec. And more importantly, they represent the general public. They're not bought into the idea of hiring someone with a disability, but they'd be interested in trying, most of them. Some of them have, some of them that have policies that basically, it's almost as if they don't want to hire people with disabilities. But we approached them and we proposed a partnership. And to make it credible, we also approached the CRISPES, which is a Center for Research on Inclusion for People with Disabilities here in Quebec. And we brought up a program where it was either going to be a 3 or 6 hour program. And all it is let's make an inclusive, let's work with your human resources so that they could have inclusive job offers. And we're going to coach them on how to do job interviews and how to make a job interview to see the worker and not the disability. And that is the whole idea. We're trying to change this paradigm. We don't want to see people with disabilities who want to go to work. We want employers to see workers with a disability. And the key word is workers. They bought it. And we developed a 3-year plan with them. And basically, it was really interesting because there is another corporation here, an association for certified human resource professionals that when they saw the program also bought in. So what we have now is human resource professionals having access to a training program where they could come in and basically learn about hiring someone with a disability, making it easier for them to meet with them and making it easier for them to have interviews and making it an inclusive society, community. Developing inclusive communities within the workplace is challenging. We're working with the employers, we're working with the union reps, we're working with people from the health field, and we're naturally working with the individuals. But what we're seeing is now that we're going more towards the general public, there is much more opening. There is a greater opening towards, yeah, sure, let's hire them up. What also helps is we went around the province, and one of the things that came out is employers see every time they're dealing with government policy, it's too much red tape, too much bureaucracy, not enough support, and basically they feel that they're left on their own. And a lot of them are scared, what's going to happen if something happens to my employee and who's going to take care of them? And so by flipping it around, what we've done is we gave them the course, and it was really interesting because we actually we also had training modules, and we hired actors who are people with disabilities and who are professional actors, and they played the roles of the employers and the employees, and everything was what's going on in your mind when the person is sitting in front of you. Should I ask him about his disability? Should I ask him about limitations? Should I ask him about accommodations? And the person comes forward and explains it to him that in the end, the best person around the table to explain what type of accommodations I need is the person who's been living with this disability all his life, because we know what we're talking about. And it breaks down, and it was funny the way that the people in human resources actually bought in. And towards the end, what they were when they were answering anyway, is that they have a better understanding and they're more open. The key was that we also assured them a continuity. Excuse me. So what we have is we have support and employment services all over Quebec. Every region has a specified supported employment service to deal with all the follow-ups that these people that went to the courses actually have, if they have questions, if they have job offers, if they need accommodations, whatever they could basically need, we take care of it. And what the result is that they're hiring more people. They have their job now anyway. When they send us their job offers are inclusive and they're easy to follow. And they consider things that everything now on the web, every job offer is easy. If someone has, example, a language disability or, visual disability, and I'm sorry because I know all these terms in French and I'm translating them to English while we go along. But anyway, it's like they just adapted the site so that everybody could have, when you're talking about, I'm pointing to people, when you're talking about communication, they adapted their site so everybody could, who accesses the job offer actually could see the job offer and could follow up on the job offer. Look, it's small steps, but it's interesting because we're going in the right direction.
And what's really interesting there is just how I find anyway, is how you're using an opportunity like manpower. People require workers, and using that as an opportunity to help people learn and bring them on board. And I think Yutta, perhaps you could talk too about that whole area, because you're doing the same thing, I think, in terms of Disability Issues Office to bring people on board and using opportunities that you've been presented with recently.
Yeah, and I have to say that I think this conference is already having the impact it should, because I want to follow up with my fellow panelists and use their expertise. It's really interesting to learn what you're doing. And so one example that I would say that we're looking at COVID-19 as, it's breaking how things are normally done, and it's creating a new normal. And that has both kind of risks and opportunities for us. I mean, there are one opportunity that was named today is that people are working from home, and that is a classic accommodation that helps so many people. And the language among the people that Joseph were talking about, some of the businesses, they don't use the word accommodation. So we always have to step back and think about how we just want, barrier-free access to the opportunities that every Canadian wants. And right now, every Canadian can empathize with job insecurity and risk of future and the need to do things just a little bit differently, away from the norm to accommodate current circumstances. And for us, we see that in our Disabilities Issues Office as an opening to talk to people who do not normally talk about accommodations and are scared and have the stigma associated with disability and accommodations, to have a conversation where it's the whole population that is affected. In Manitoba, unlike in Ontario, our accessibility legislation is called the the Accessibility for Manitobans Act. There's no word in there about disability because we think everybody needs access. And currently COVID-19 is showing us we all need access. We all need accommodations in different ways. Sometimes it's to pick up a child from daycare. Sometimes it's because of a dentist appointment. And if you are a person with a disability, it may be a larger screen. It may be ergonomic chair. It could be a number of things. And so we're using this opportunity to also talk to organizations like Safe Work. So it's for us the same as what Joseph is talking about, an organization that is already interacting with lots of employers, with lots of different interests. And we're saying, you want to talk to all employers about accessibility right now. It's important for everyone. It's important on the employee front, but it's also as they roll out services and they want to, keep having customers come to them, they want to talk about accessibility. So that is the opportunity in a very, dire circumstances. In Manitoba right now, it's super serious. But we also see this opening that accessibility affects all of us. So why should it be marginalized and over in that corner? And why should there be a flag over a person that, I have a disability and require accommodation? It's a matter of we're diverse in so many different ways. And we just have to acknowledge that. And it makes all of our workplaces more successful, more innovative, better able to achieve their mandate.
Yeah, it's kind of get rid of those labels or the word adjustment. Yeah, is that fitting with you at all, Catherine, in terms of that? You want to come back to the idea of attitude, and certainly this is, I think, opportunity perhaps for public attitudes to shift, or public servant attitudes. What do you think?
Yes, certainly resonated with me, Yutta. The whole idea of competitive edge really now is what the pandemic should be saying to our consumer base and to employers is that the more innovative and more accessible we are, you will actually have a competitive edge, because we've seen what a disruption in services that are only available in one way has meant to our economy and to our bottom line. And again, it's around shifting the conversation, and that it is not necessarily about an accommodation, but about being flexible and ready and responsive, because we live in a world now that is forever changed. I think some people are thinking the pandemic, once we get over this, and the next wave, and then we get everybody gets the vaccine. But this is the beginning of a new world, really. We've seen a virus we've never seen before impact us globally. We are forever changed. And so what an opportunity for us as a public service, as well as the community at large, to say, what can we do differently? And probably one of the things that we can do best is to be nimble. And I think that could change the conversation from person X has something that needs this specialized, when in fact, if we look at it, what can we do to support the work in a way that makes sense to the people who it impacts the most? So yes, and I think that ties into attitudinal barriers for sure.
I think so too. And you often hear right now this, the phrase we'll go back to normal soon. When are we going to get back to normal? And that, our society doesn't usually talk like that. And we might want to try to shift that language too, because normal wasn't so great for a lot of people. Joseph, what are you thinking in terms of this whole area of shifting ideas and or drawing other people in who haven't been engaged before?
Well, the way I see it is, look, we're here to help people find jobs, and traditionally we start with the individual and we build. I think we have to look at the employers as well, and what could we do for them? In Quebec, over 80% of employers have less than 100 employees. They don't have the time. That's what they tell us. They don't have the time. We have all kinds of programs to finance accommodations. They don't, either they don't know what they are, they don't have the time to take care of it, or they're not interested because of the paperwork. I think it's important that things are local and regional, that programs are adapted to the region. Look, I have colleagues that are further up north where they don't have many services. And then we're in urban areas where you have access to everything. But you can't have one size fits all. I think that the danger with policy of one size fits all is that it fits nobody in the end. I think that it's important that the communication is based on need and that we have time to identify. The fact that the employers went out and actually surveyed their members to see, well, who hires people with disabilities? You'd think that the government would have done that first, because they're the ones making policy. I mean, when you find out that 90% of companies don't have a diversity plan, or, there's something wrong there. There's something wrong in 2020 when diversity is not an integral part of the way you're functioning, especially that economically it only makes good sense. So we're still there. I mean, we're still in rules where there's nothing that forces a business owner to make sure that there's an adapted bathroom for someone with restricted mobility. It makes no sense that you have to tell someone, well, I'd love to hire you, but we don't have a bathroom for you. And so you would have to use the bathroom across the street at the hospital. Mm-hmm. Now, that makes no sense what I just told you, but it's actually a reality. Sure. I mean, do we actually have to have a rule that makes it that every single person who goes to work is allowed to use the bathroom? Mm-hmm. Now, when we don't have that rule anymore, when we need that one, that's a good thing. I think that's a good place to start. Yeah. We have too many people with mobility issues that don't have access to basic needs, which makes no sense.
It's certainly the experience that people live with every day. Even the ones that you've just described that seem so kind of bizarre that could ever happen, but it is the experience every day. I'm going to just check in with one last area, and that is, how do we bring that experience of people every day to the tables? And I guess particularly right now is that the economic recovery tables. And that how do we get the voice there? And Yutta, do you want to jump in on that? And we'll do a quick.
Sure. I think in very different levels of engagement, but I totally agree that already, maybe in Manitoba right now, we're upping the closures, but we're also talking about the recovery. And just what you said, we recently had a webinar on the future of work. Well, the future isn't a pinpoint. We are just disrupting the new normal right now. So we are talking about the future of work, and we are talking about the increasing use of technology, which is typically identified with the future of work and what that means for people with disabilities and for a diverse workforce. So I think that there are lots of very modern, very technological ways of bringing people to the table, but it's important that we continue to have organizations that represent people with disabilities. And for me, that's always, that's the point of departure. And actually, the truth of that is that we need to keep funding those organizations. Over the last decade, they've lost a lot of their funding. And you can't just bring a person with a disability to the table and say that, oh, well, now this area is represented, because as we all know, it's not a homogeneous group. I think that's how we started the conversation today. So I think for me, the bottom of line, and I say that as a government employee, is that we need to have non-government organizations representative of people with disabilities. And that's how we're going to help plan the way forward. So that's my first point of departure, and I'll let other people add.
Hey, Catherine, I saw you nodding a bit.
I think actually the government of Newfoundland and Labrador does a really good job of consultations around persons with disabilities and lived experience. I do think our consultation process is quite accessible. Not only did we do a communication policy, but we also did a public engagement policy that was around accessibility. And I think we actually are utilizing that to its fullest. We too at Newfoundland and Labrador, our government has a commitment to legislation, and I'd be lying if Yutta didn't now tell everybody we've been calling Manitoba nonstop every other day. So we are learning. You have paved the way for us. But that consultation process was very robust. It was very accessible. There were alternate ways to share your voice. Our government has gotten into a process where after consultations, a document is made public around what we heard. And then from that, the recommendations. We have a minister responsible for the status of persons with disabilities. We have a couple of mechanisms that community organizations can leverage to have their voice heard. And I do think that this Disability Policy Office also engages really strongly with the community. So we do have an avenue for an exchange of point of views. We have a Provincial Advisory Council on the inclusion of persons with disabilities. So I actually think government of Newfoundland and Labrador is doing a really good job of getting that voice to the table and integrating it into the decisions. Do we have room to grow and get better? Absolutely. But I think we've got a really strong relationship where community can tell us when we're doing a good job and when we're not doing a good job. So I think it's key.
You mentioned earlier that community certainly do tell you when off the rails, perhaps, which is great. Eh? Just about a minute and a half left. Joseph, anything that you want to?
Well, I could tell you that in Quebec we do have a lot of legislation. We're in the second phase of a 10-year job strategy for people with disabilities. I think what's most important with all the legislation that's come out in the last years is that it makes the government accountable. It makes us accountable. It assures our funding. I think that by ensuring our funding, the government sees us as partners. We're grassroots, but we're down with, look, most of our organizations started because people came in, or people with disabilities actually started us up because they were looking for work and they couldn't find any. So they decided to start for organizations like the one I work with. And what's beautiful about it is that we just managed to grow because more and more people want to go to work. And I think the biggest part about it all is the accountability. The government is accountable, and they want to be accountable. That's why we have strategies, and we do a lot of consultations, but they've put into play things like projects, 3-year programs where we can finance innovation and development and research. And so now we have numbers, where before it was all good intentions. Now we have numbers. And I think that's the solution. We have workers that want to work, and we have the numbers to show that there's not enough of us in the workplace right now. And just to double that number would be great. So that's where we're going. That's the direction we're taking.
Super. Well, we could keep going for some time and into wee hours, I'm sure, to have this discussion. And thank you. But I want to thank you very much. We are at the end of our allotted time. There is going to be time for questions, and we'll be inviting questions and hope to hear your questions. But just before we go there, I do want to thank the guests, all 4 of you, very, very much for what you've shared. And I think a lot of what you've said too has related directly to the Pan-Canadian strategy on disability and work in Canada, in terms of that respect for people as individuals, and the importance of partnership, and the necessity of persons with disabilities being at the table, and being able to change and how we work, so that it works for everybody. So thank you, and please send us and call us and chat and let us know what your questions are. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, everybody.